Morning. Thank you for your patience with the coffee this morning. We just had to get people flowing, and always enjoy those Donut House donuts from Salkeld Avenue from the North End. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Archbishop Richard Gagnon, who will be introducing our keynote speaker. Your Grace.
Good morning, everyone. My introduction will be very, very short. I don't have all the information, all the details that sometimes you hear in introducing a speaker. But our speaker, Mr. Brett Salkeld, did I pronounce it correctly? Pretty close. I get the same thing with Gagnon. Is the theologian for the Archdiocese of Regina. Brett has a degree in education. He is a writer of a number of books. I think currently he's working on a book on teaching, Catholic teachers, which should be very interesting. He was appointed by the CCCB as part of the dialogue between Catholics and evangelicals. He's a well-known speaker. We've chosen a number of, well, I didn't choose them, it was sort of a consensus, a number of topics that are, I guess, pertinent today. And as Catholics, we live in challenging times, or any Christian lives in challenging times today. In order to articulate your faith, to articulate our faith, and to present the Christian proposition to people, that there's another way of looking at things through the eyes of the Gospels. And this is very valuable. So we're very privileged today to have Brett with us, and I'm sure he'll fill in the details that I haven't mentioned in my introduction. So without further ado, I present to you Brett Salkeld, our speaker today.
Well, good morning, good Catholics. I want to start by saying that I'm honored and I'm excited to be here. I have a real passion for Catholic education. I have an ed degree, and I worked briefly in schools before going on to graduate studies in theology. I was so excited to come here that when they canceled my flight yesterday, I said I'm going to come anyways. So they canceled my flight yesterday morning and put me on an 8 o'clock flight, which they overbooked severely with all the people from the canceled flight. And at 7:30, they told me I wouldn't get on. So I drove here, and I got to my hotel at 3 in the morning. So I'm running on speakers, adrenaline, and caffeine. So but it's nice if I don't do as good a job as I hoped. I have an excuse built in. So. Also, because my flight was canceled yesterday morning, I went into the office and made, for the first time in my life, 2 PowerPoint presentations. So I had all my stuff written up, but I put together, so these are rookie PowerPoint presentations. Please be gentle with me in your judgment of them, but I thought they might help us, so I hope they're helpful in following my argument. I didn't, in consultation with the group, I didn't pick easy topics. So I'm going to do my best to communicate clearly on some things that are not always easy, but I think they're so important, and the Archbishop and the group that brought me in agreed that they're so important we should give them a try. My goal is to speak for an hour or less here and leave time for Q&A, so I'm going to be watching the clocks here. I started around 10:40. And I want to leave time for Q&A because I expect and I hope that I'm going to say a few things that you haven't heard before that might sound like maybe you want to challenge them or go deeper, or maybe I don't say it as clearly as I would have liked and you'd like some clarification. There's a phone number at the bottom there. You can text your questions to that phone number, and then the questions will be curated and maybe combined, might be some common themes. And in Q&A, the questions will show up on the screen, and we can address them that way. just be aware, text at any time when the question comes up, but it may be something that gets answered later in the talk, so you might, write the question while it's fresh in your mind, but wait for a bit before you send it, just in case it gets dealt with. But they'll also do curating on their end. So I'm extremely open to questions. I love Q&A. I think it's one of the most important things we can do, because it ensures that the speaker doesn't just talk about what the speaker is interested in, but eventually at least talks about what you're interested in. So there's a few areas where I'm gonna skim over a little and not go into real depth on everything, or we'd be here for 2 weeks. But if there's something that really interests you, make a note of that in a text. All right, and now I point at the screen and it changes. Look at that. Some of us may have seen this quote from St. John Paul II. It's from his encyclical on faith and reason. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. This is a little surprising, I think, to many people in our culture because of the operating definitions of faith and reason that are out there. I think a lot of times in the culture we imagine that faith and reason are opposites, that they can't exist together, maybe that they can't work together, sometimes that one actually has to completely overrule the other one, and they're in a kind of zero-sum game. The Catholic faith has always insisted that faith and reason belong together. They're not only compatible, they're actually inseparable. Everything we know or believe comes through a combination of faith and reason, and I'm going to talk about how that works. But I want to lead with that quote, and then I want to mention, before we get into the nitty-gritty of how it works, why this question is so important for us today in Catholic education. The first thing is, many of us will have read studies that say young people leaving the church very often cite this issue. They say, I don't need faith, I have reason. Sometimes this is framed in terms of, I don't need religion, I have science. That one of them, faith will eventually be completely outdated because we'll eventually know everything by reason and faith gets sort of wiped out. This is an extremely common worldview, and our kids hear it all over the internet and in other places where they encounter popular culture. I'm sure that any of you who teach in either religion or in science will have had students in your classes articulate things like this. So it's really important in terms of our vocation as Catholic educators to pass on the faith to our children that we get this one right. But it's not only about passing the faith on to our children, it's actually a larger cultural question as well. Many of us will be frustrated with the way our public discourse happens nowadays, that our politics seem largely based on appeals to fear or anger, a lot of identity politics and name-calling, and a seemingly ever-decreasing capacity to engage in reason together in public with people with whom we disagree. And I want to argue that a Catholic vision of the relationship between faith and reason actually gives us tools for engaging with other people with whom we disagree in the public sphere, when we recognize that nobody's operating from a space of pure reason, but we all have prior commitments that we're bringing into our discussions. This is fun. It's like magic. All right, so when we imagine that faith and reason are opposites, they're separable, or maybe even mutually exclusive, I think there's two main worldviews that emerge from that kind of separation. And we've probably encountered both of them in our classrooms, but also in our families, in the broader culture. We've probably even encountered them, at least the second one, in our pews and in ourselves. So the first one is simpler and blunter and more straightforward. Faith is bad, reason is good. people need to stop believing things on faith and only believe things on reason. People who believe things by faith are silly, they're unreasonable, and they're probably even dangerous. If anyone's ever seen Bill Maher's Religulous documentary, that's the idea behind it. These are silly, dangerous people. And we often call this the new atheism, and this is very appealing to a lot of our young people, in particular, in my experience, to our young men. And all the leading proponents of the new atheism happen to be men as well. The second one, which is, I think, more common that we have to even watch for in ourselves, is faith is good, belief is good. We might even have a little plaque in our house that just says believe, right? Doesn't say what to believe, just believe, because believing is good, right? Faith is good, but it has actually no connection with reason. So what I believe on certain questions, at least, is over here, and what I engage with my reason is over here. And therefore, there's actually no categories that any of us can use to engage with what another person believes, especially if we disagree with them. People might believe things because of some deep conviction or intuition. They might believe something because of their family heritage. They might believe something because they just heard a kooky speaker on YouTube. There's all kinds of reasons people believe things. But because of the way we understand freedom of religion often in democracies, we say, well, people are free to believe, and we can't ever step in and say, this is reasonable, this is not. So we believe in crystals and horoscopes and political messiahs, and some people believe in church too, but it's all just believing, and we all have a right to do it. But there's no place to engage with whether a belief is true, because there's no objective standard outside of the person's own experience by which we can engage, which makes political discourse really difficult, because people believe all kinds of things, and they believe them very deeply, but they can't engage with other people, and so they must be kept private. And so we are told over and over that religious convictions must be private. If you're a politician, you can't bring your religious convictions into your work as a politician. If you're a citizen who happens to have beliefs on any number of things, you can believe them on your own, but please do not bring them into the public sphere. And so we have right now the Canada Summer Jobs program that says, you have to publicly attest to believing something. We don't care what you believe privately, the government assures us. We're not actually trying to coerce your private belief. But publicly, you have to attest to something if you're going to participate in our society in this way. This remarkable separation, and it doesn't work because people actually can't separate what they believe by faith and what they believe by reason, because everything we believe is always a combination of faith and reason. Even if we're doing that poorly and unreflectively, we can't actually escape the interaction between faith and reason in all our believing. So I'm going to talk about how that works. The first thing to notice is that the things we believe, that we might imagine we believe by pure reason, that don't come with any sort of prior commitments, that's actually an illusion, because anytime we believe anything, we're actually starting from a series of presuppositions or faith commitments about the way the world is and about the way we are. So, for example, in general, we trust our senses. Now, we learn that sometimes they're tricky, but in general, we trust our senses, and we trust our reason. We can't reason to trusting our reason. We have faith that we are the kinds of beings who have a capacity for truth. We can look at the universe, which is intelligible, and we can make some sense out of it. If we don't start with a faith in reason, we can't actually go anywhere else. We're stuck. So we start always with faith in at least reason and in our senses, and in our own capacity for truth, and in the intelligibility of the world. But then, if we look at how we live our life, we actually make a whole bunch of other investments of faith where we believe things that we don't verify ourselves. There are things that are verifiable in principle. How far away is England? What's the population of the world? Does the Earth go around the sun or vice versa? What's the speed of light? These are verifiable in principle, but most of us here have never verified any of those things. We've simply trusted the authorities who we think have the capacity to verify those sort of, at least in approximations, right? And so we live our life constantly trusting or believing in things that we can't verify. Now this sounds actually quite dangerous, right? Like we're all just sheep with, who are forced to sort of trust all these authorities. And maybe even we trust our own reason, and what if it doesn't work? Like what if we're all just deceived into it, right? This sounds actually quite dangerous, that we live in this space where we have to start by trusting. And the key is we start by trusting, but we don't stop at trusting. Faith does not say, I trust my senses, and therefore, no matter what happens, I will trust my senses. You say, I have to start with trusting my senses, but if something emerges, I'm seeing double, I'm smelling burnt toast, but there's no toast around, right? There's something going on with my senses that are deceptive, and so I submit the report of my senses to reason. Same thing with my trust in reason. I trust that I am reasonable. That doesn't mean my reason always works perfectly. And so if I reason my way to something, and someone else of goodwill reasons their way to something, and they don't agree, and we're having a conversation, I can subject my own faith in my own reason to critique from outside, and I can say, well, maybe I missed something a little bit there, right? So the fact that we have faith in all kinds of things does not mean you leave your reason at the door. We have faith in authorities, political, religious, scientific, and we all know we take a lot of things from those people on faith, but we don't turn off our reason because, oddly enough, it turns out they're not always as trustworthy as we hoped. And so we always keep our reason engaged even after we've made a commitment of faith. And the Christian faith does not ask us to do anything different. The Christian faith has insisted from the beginning that the claims of Christian faith are not impervious to reason, but rather can be more deeply understood when reflected on with human reason. Here's a famous quote from St. Augustine that reflects this basic dynamic in human believing. That we can't actually ever end up understanding anything if we don't start by believing in something. It's actually necessary to believe first in order to understand, but that doesn't mean you absolutize the initial belief in such a way that it's above any rational critique. Now this raises, I think, at least a couple questions. Is there any way around this? Can I just not trust anything? And how would I go about doing that, right? Because this seems dangerous. I want to be a radical skeptic. I don't want to start by trusting my senses, my reason, any political, religious, scientific authority. That's irresponsible, so I'm going to be radically skeptical. Notice what you have to do to be able to get to that position. You have to reason that you can't trust even your reason. You have to reason that you can't trust these authorities. You have to reason that you can't trust your senses. You have to reason that you can't trust your own reason. It's a valiant attempt to get out of it, but there's actually no escape. Even that position at the root of it presumes some faith in my own reason. There's another thing I want to talk about that I came up with in more detail after I made the PowerPoint. There's another way to try to get around this, which is, I think, much more dangerous. And it is to imagine that I'm not subject to it. And you see this in our discourse. It's a fascinating thing to watch in our political and social discourse. People are very aware that other people are not neutral. You are coming to this debate with some preconceived notion. This other group is coming with this other preconceived notion. Everyone has their faith commitments, whether those are religious faith or whatever they are, but not me. I exist in the neutral space from where I can judge all the other people who disagree with me because they are biased. By the way, governments are really good at this. This is a classic move of government, is to say that we exist in the neutral space, and all the interest groups that approach us for whatever, we can dismiss their concerns because they are biased, but we live in the neutral space. This is extremely dangerous. Anyone who is convinced that they're the only ones who live in a neutral space find it very easy to justify actions over against people who are biased, right? I live in a place where I have a unique access to truth, and therefore my point of view is privileged in policy in a whole range of areas, right? So watch out for these claims to false neutrality, right? All of us are starting from a given point of view. We can't duck it. All right, the second problem with this idea that we have to place our trust somewhere is, well, what if we misplace it? And here's the bad news: we misplace it all the time. We trust our own senses and our own reason, which are fallible. We trust all kinds of authorities, which are fallible. We trust, although we trust news sources less and less these days, but to some degree, we trust what we read in newspapers, what we hear from political and religious leaders. And it doesn't always work out. This is where we get to the real heart of the Christian insight on this matter. Faith is always seeking understanding. It never stops at a given set of claims, but always wonders more. What does this claim mean? How does this claim relate to these other claims? These other things that I thought were true, how does that relate? There's a quote I wanted to share with you before I moved on. Don't read the whole quote. It's too long. Read the bolded part in the middle. This is from a wonderful book called Introduction to Christianity. There are two sources that you should read if you're really interested in the relationship between faith and reason in the Christian tradition. One is John Paul II's encyclical, Fides et Ratio, and the second is the first 50 pages of Joseph Ratzinger's, later Benedict XVI, but he wrote this before he was Pope. He wrote it in the late 1960s, in fact. Introduction to Christianity. The first 50 pages focus on this word, the words at the beginning of the creed, I believe, and what does it mean to believe. And at one point in that, he makes this remarkable claim, and this goes to the skeptic. I should have shown you this when I was talking about the skeptic. For the one, the believer, faith is present against doubt. For the other, it is present through doubt and in the form of doubt. Even the skeptic has a kind of faith, even if that faith takes the form of doubt. Now look at the last line. Perhaps in precisely this way, doubt, which saves both sides from being shut up in their own worlds, could become an avenue of communication. Joseph Ratzinger had a bit of a reputation as kind of a stiff dogmatist, but what he says here is remarkably open. He says, to the non-believer and the believer have at the root of their believing or non-believing a common humanity that can only approach truth in a certain way that does not permit them the kind of certainty that would let them exclude one another. And so they must be able to engage. Pope Francis has also said interesting things about doubt, that faith and doubt are not opposites, but in certain ways they're the opposite sides of a coin, because they both place a person in a position of making some prior commitment before they can do their reasoning, right? All right, so let's go to the next one now. Faith seeking understanding. This is the classic Catholic and Christian, but Catholic in particular, definition of theology. That faith is not just given here, you must believe this. This is the presentation we're often told in the popular culture. Your bishops, they just tell you what to believe, or your pope, he just tells you what to believe, and you have to follow blindly. Christianity and Catholicism in particular has insisted that faith should never be blind, that faith never leaves reason behind. Faith has to do what reason can't do. It has to make a certain leap and a certain commitment that may be reasonable, but it's not reason itself that makes the commitment. But once you've made the commitment, and once you've got the information, once you're learning from Scripture, from the teachings of the church, from the lives of the saints, wherever, you're constantly engaging that with what you already know and relating that to your reason. Look at Mary in the Annunciation. Mary is the first theologian because she hears something pretty outrageous. You're going to have a baby. But Mary knows where babies come from. And she says, I'm not sure how that's going to work, sir, because I haven't actually had anything to do with any of that, right? But notice what she doesn't say. She doesn't say, no, you're wrong. This is not how it's happening. She doesn't say, I must be hallucinating. You're not really here. So she trusts the message of the angel, but she doesn't understand it right away because it doesn't match up with what she already knows about how the world works. And so she says, how can this be? That is the perfect theological question. You hear something from the church that doesn't line up with what you think you know about the world? How can this be? Not, you've got to be kidding me, church, or I don't believe you're actually saying this, but if I'm hearing this right, this doesn't line up maybe, I have to go do some digging. I need to figure out how this works out. So she asked the angel, how can this be? And the angel explains to her, yeah, no, you're right. It's not actually going to happen the way babies normally happen. This is a God thing. It's kind of a special one-off event. It doesn't, And that's enough at the moment. Mary says, let it be done to me, right? She understands that this isn't, like in classical Greek mythology, this would be a rape scene, right? Like Zeus didn't use words and communicate by the spirit. Zeus took the form of like a horse or something and had his way, right? So she's like, okay, so it's not going to be like that. I'm okay with that. That's good. But does she fully understand exactly what went on? What do we hear at the end of the story? She pondered these things in her heart, right? So she got a certain level of understanding by asking the question, okay, this isn't going to be how babies usually come about, but this is a great mystery, and so I understand it a bit more than I did, and I'm going to keep pondering it in my heart, right? This is the way faith seeks understanding. When we run into a roadblock, we dig deeper, but we never wrap it up completely. We never have the full picture so that we have nothing more to learn. We can always keep engaging. And so the church will tell us when our faith and our reason seem to be in conflict, one or both of them is off somewhere. Either we've misunderstood the claim of faith, or we've misused our reason, or in principle both, but we will never get to a place where they're actually in direct conflict. We should keep digging until we can see with our reason how the claim of faith makes sense and can be integrated in our lives. Sometimes this is easier and sometimes this is harder. Sometimes you hear something and that kind of fits pretty well. Maybe you ask one or two questions and things sort themselves out. Sometimes you learn something new from faith or reason and you say, I don't know how that fits. And I have to go in and do some hard work and say, oh, what I thought the church said about creation and evolution, for example, is not what the church said about creation and evolution. And there's not really the problem that I thought there was. And so I can carry on. Or I might be in a place where I had a radical misapprehension, either in what I thought the faith was claiming, or my reason went right off the rails, and I might have to radically readjust something. Now, do we have any science teachers in the room? Does that sound like anything you're familiar with? That's a sort of popular overview of scientific method, right? You try something out with a hypothesis. If it confirms what you know, good. If it challenges what you know, you start digging. How does this new thing relate to this other thing that I thought I knew? And every once in a while, something actually revolutionizes the field, because something that we thought was true in some partial way or whatever, and we have a brand new context. It's not an accident that the scientific method only emerges, at least as popular, as articulated and carefully sort of worked out, in medieval Europe after theologians had been working for centuries on the relationship between faith and reason. It's actually a very similar process. In Introduction to Christianity, Joseph Ratzinger even talks about a God experiment. That you have to do something like a hypothesis. You have to say, if God is a possibility, what does that mean? And only then can God show up in your life. You know the famous atheist prayer? So many atheists who become believers at some point break down and say, God, if you're there, I just need a sign. I need some kind of sign. You hear this story over and over from atheists who've become believers because they've made this experiment and God showed up. All right, so the last of this section is just to note, when we keep faith and reason in the appropriate relationship with one another, reason purifies faith and keeps it from becoming superstition and keeps it from becoming a private thing that cannot be communicated in the world and that is sort of immune from any critique. So we always need reason in faith. But faith keeps reason humble because it tells us that nobody starts from a neutral place and gets to pronounce from on high from their place of pure reason over against everyone else. And so when we recognize that nobody starts in a neutral, but we all come with commitments, then we can actually engage with other people. Have you noticed, maybe on social media, but now increasingly even in media, that our culture presumes more and more that the reason someone disagrees with you is because they're either stupid or evil? It's extremely frustrating. We can't have good disagreements because if I have pure reason and you disagree with me, you're either just too dumb to get it or you're ill-willed, right? So a recognition of the role of faith keeps reason humble and allows us to actually engage with one another. All right, what I want to do in the second part of this talk is look at what happens with this in the classroom. So, part one, philosophy teachers, religion teachers, this is our job. This needs to come across in our classroom. Our students should not leave a Catholic education system without an awareness of how faith and reason relate to one another. It's good for them. It's good in terms of keeping them attached to their faith and understanding their faith, but it's also good for the world because we send out citizens who can actually work with other people. So super important in religion and philosophy class. But there's a great danger in Catholic education. In Saskatchewan, we have publicly funded Catholic education. So there's always this fight, we got to shut down the Catholic schools, we'll combine them, and how will we take care of the people who wanted Catholic schools? Well, we'll give them a religion class, as an elective in a public school. And what this imagines is whatever happens in religion class is completely disconnected from the rest of the curriculum. There's no relationship there. And I want to argue today that what Catholics believe about faith and reason actually has implications for the whole curriculum. I can't go through the whole curriculum today. The book I'm writing, a big part of it is going to be looking at different subject areas and seeing how does the Catholic vision of faith and reason relate to career ed, phys ed, health, music, whatever. Today, I'm going to look at 3 that I think are pretty important and that should highlight some different ways in which faith and reason show up in our classroom. So we're going to spend the last bit looking at science class, history class, and health class. Now, the first thing to note is to teach science or anything from a Catholic point of view does not mean the content of science changes. There's the 3 of them, and science. We're not saying that the answer on the physics exam is going to be different if you're at St. Paul's than if you're down the street at the public school, right? The content stays the same, but there is no neutral context. Everything, including math class, is taught from within a certain worldview. You actually can't avoid teaching from within a worldview, even if that worldview is, I have no worldview. Sorry, that's your worldview. There's no way around it. And so, we're not saying the content changes, but what kinds of things about a Catholic context will inform the way we teach science. A quick note before we get to science. In dealing with science, social studies, and health, I've left out literature and the arts. They're a little bit different because there you can actually infuse a bunch of Catholic content, right? You can read Catholic novels, you can sing Catholic cantatas, you can read Catholic poetry, you can look at Catholic sculpture, right? We have a great artistic and literary tradition, and we can study that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't study non-Catholic art. Of course, we should do that too. Catholics will take beauty wherever they can find it, right? But we should know a bit of our own artistic tradition. But in science, where there is no like Catholic physics and then non-Catholic physics, how do we teach science in a Catholic worldview? One of the things we can do is be aware that science has presuppositions as a discipline that actually have their roots in Catholic reflection on human knowing. First of all, before you're going to do science, you have to affirm that the world is intelligible. Secondly, you have to affirm that you are the kind of thing that can access that intelligibility. You have a capacity for relating to the order in creation so that you can understand it, right? You have faith in your reason that you can actually do this work, draw conclusions, continue on in the work. So there's presuppositions behind science that explain historically how it ended up emerging in the time and place where it did, in a Catholic and sort of also just after the Reformation, broadly Christian context. The second thing we might note is the Catholic history of science. There's a really interesting book that all Catholic science teachers should at least read one chapter of it. It's by Rodney Stark, and it's called Bearing False Witness. And there's a chapter in there on the Catholic history of science, and it goes through all the breakthroughs that were made in the late medieval period by people you probably haven't heard of because they were before Copernicus. Some of them we would have heard of, Francis Bacon maybe, but some others, Robert Grosseteste and stuff, and the Bishop of Lincoln, most of us won't have heard of, who made remarkable breakthroughs that led directly to the scientific revolution, and they are virtually all monks, priests, and bishops. It's a remarkable thing to read. So to be aware of that. Another thing to be aware of that can sneak into a science class, either because the teacher brings it in, some of the students are certain to bring it in, it's out there in the popular culture, is what we call scientism. Scientism is an attitude towards science that says science is the only way of accessing truth. So if I can't discover something by the scientific method, it's not true in any meaningful sense. I might believe all kinds of things because they make me feel nice about myself or because I've been brainwashed by a religious organization or whatever, but the only things that are true in any meaningful way are things that I can discern through the scientific method. Now, there's a few problems with this. One is it gives this false sense of neutrality, which is generally dangerous. Second, it's got a kind of fundamentalist desire for certainty. I will know the exact truth about everything by this method. I leave no room for the possibility of continued learning. Like, once we figure out all the science, that's all, then we're done. Like, we figured out life, the universe, and everything. That's the only kind of field that's valuable. And the deepest problem with scientism is that it's actually self-refuting, because the claim, the only things that are true in any meaningful sense are those discernible by the scientific method, is not itself discernible by the scientific method. It's a philosophical claim, and it has to be reasoned to without recourse to the scientific method. So it's a self-refuting kind of claim. But it's very tempting for people who want a really nice, tight, compartmentalized worldview. And so often, our young people can tend towards fundamentalism in their religious practice. They tend to grow out of it. They can also tend towards fundamentalism in their attitudes towards science. That's what we call scientism. One of the things that follows from scientism is we forget that scientific data needs to be reflected on in philosophy or law or culture or whatever, and able to make decisions about what to do with our scientific power. But if science itself is the only way of knowing anything, we often skip that step. And so you will often see in arguments today in the public forum about how do we use science, arguments that have been parodied as a hashtag, because science. And one place you'll see this is embryonic stem cell research. People will just say, if you disagree with that, I'm not going to deal with your philosophical, moral, legal, whatever concerns. You simply disagree with science. Full stop. If you disagree with me on this claim, you disagree with me. You're just disagreeing with science. And this is becoming a more and more common form of argumentation, and it's really a way of begging the question. You're ducking the issue that's actually at hand. But that kind of argument becomes possible when you think that other ways of knowing aren't actually meaningful. So in our science classes, we should be aware of how arguments about and from science are used in the public sphere, and we should be able to have critical lenses to how that's done. And our Catholic understanding of faith and reason gives us lenses to do that. A last one, and this leads into history, which we'll talk about next, is a belief in salvation by technology. You can watch a TED Talk where they will tell you that some amazing thing is going to happen. And it's like, technology actually does do amazing things. I just read a book about the history of genes, and there's chapters at the end about the potential of gene therapy. Like, there are things in there that make you want to stand up and sing, right? That you would actually be able to do a diagnosis in utero, go in and turn off a cancer gene before a child is born. Who wouldn't want to be able to do that? I mean, there are beautiful things we can do with technology. But when we tell ourselves these stories about how great technology is going to make our future, we ignore what we've done with technology in our past. The Wright brothers, who created the airplane, believed that the airplane would be the end of war. Because when you could fly over the enemy and see their armies amassed, it would be a deterrent. You would say, the carnage will be too great. We will not fight. We have to make peace because this is going to be a mess. Of course, they lived to see World War I, which was the greatest carnage the world had managed to produce to that point. And airplanes were used as surveillance, which they hoped, right? Let's fly over the enemy and see what they're doing. But for some reason, humans, being humans, didn't use that information to panic into making peace, but somebody figured out that if you were flying over the enemy and you had a grenade, you could pull the pin out of it and throw it over the side of the plane and drop a grenade on the enemy. Now, one of the Wright brothers died between World War I and World War II, but the one who lived longest lived to see Hiroshima. He saw an airplane drop a bomb that annihilated hundreds of thousands of people in a matter of seconds, and it broke him. It's very easy for us when we see something as miraculous as an airplane to imagine all the good it will do, and they do great good, even when they cancel them the day before you're supposed to go talk in Winnipeg. But we keep screwing up technology all the time. And we know what's happening right now in the intermediate step before gene therapy gets to the point of fixing people's misfiring genes in utero. We're testing for misfiring genes, but we don't know how to fix them yet, so we abort the children that have them, right? It's great potential for good and great potential for evil. And we will not ever be saved by technology because technology will never get around the fact that we're the ones using it. And so it's a false kind of utopia. We can be very excited about certain inventions. We're all in a place right now. How many of our students have anxiety and depression problems because of social media and smartphones? 85%. It's huge. We didn't see that coming 10 years ago. We thought, we'll all be so connected, right? Technology is unpredictable, and it will never save us. And that can be a kind of false narrative that shows up in our ideas about science. All right, history. Associated with the salvation by technology problem is a bigger problem that we would probably place in history, which we can call the myth of progress. How many of our curricula treat liberal democracy as if it's the epitome, it's the pinnacle of human political order? We've finally figured out how to do politics, folks. We don't do fascism or communism anymore. We don't do divine right of kings. We've got liberal democracy. We've figured out politics. We were very optimistic about liberal democracy, and actually, I'm kind of a fan. Given my options, I'll take it. I'm happy to live in a liberal democracy. But do we believe that that's actually the best humans can ever do? And when we look around at the cracks that are emerging in liberal democracies around the world and the resurgence of nationalism and political deadlock and the failure of our political and educational and media and whatever institutions, there's a lot to be improved upon. But we tell the story of political ordering as if here were all these failures and now we figured it out. Not all of us tell it that way, but that's a very common way for the story to get told. I was listening with my kids. We were driving in the van, listening to a history text on CD called The Story of the World. It's an excellent history text for kids. And they were talking about Turkey wanting to become a modern European nation in the early 20th century. And so what do you do if you want to be a modern European nation? Well, you build lots of railways and you introduce democracy and you do a host of things like that, right? And they said, but one thing Turkey did at that time was not modern. It was completely medieval. They were still back in the Dark Ages. And what was that thing? It was the genocide of the Armenians, right? And I paused it. I said, stop, kids. That's crazy. Nobody in medieval Europe got anywhere near the scale of the genocide of the Armenians. But modern Europe repeated that story, and then it spread out of Europe into Asia and Africa, and that story was repeated, and in some ways, even in America, though in different ways, that story was repeated over and over and over in the modern period. Genocide, state-sponsored killing of whole groups of people, is an extremely modern phenomena. It's one of the things that defines modernity. And because we believe in this myth of progress, that the modern is always better than what came before it simply because it came after, we can look at things like genocide, which define the modern period, and call them medieval, when medieval polities and people Not that they were perfect. They did all kinds of vicious and terrible things like people always do. They never did anything like that. They never got anywhere near that scale, right? But it's the myth of progress that lets us call things like genocide medieval. Watch out for this language, the right side of history. This is a common way of phrasing things if you think you're right in the public sphere on a debate. Eventually, we will win because we are on the right side of history. Well, actually, history doesn't work that way. History has a lot of bumps in the road, and a lot of terrible things happen, and a lot of groups that thought they were on the right side of history did some of the most awful things. Nazism, from its own perspective, was on the right side of history. Stalinist communism, was very explicitly, the Marxist ideology was, this is how history will work. Our violence is justified in order to speed along the process of history, which is inevitable. We are on the right side of history. Whenever someone is on the right side, it's very easy to justify doing whatever you want to win history against the people who are on the wrong side of history. So this is another form of this myth of progress. Couple other things about history. History itself, the idea of history, is in certain ways a Christian, but not just Christian, because before it was Christian, it was Jewish. It's a Judeo-Christian idea. How many of us have read Greek mythology? So I read Greek mythology with my kids, right? And there's this terrible thing that happens all the time in Greek mythology where someone is told, you're going to die in this way, in this time and place. And what do the people do? Well, they say, well, then I guess I shouldn't go there and do that. And no matter what they do, this terrible irony emerges where their attempt to avoid their fate is exactly what causes their fate, right? Now, it's not hard to understand why humans who feel helpless in the wheels of time tell stories about how people get trapped in their fate. But history, in fact, is the opposite of fate. The belief in history as a possibility is a way of saying human freedom is actually not bound in the way that fate tells us. What you do can actually make a difference, both for you and for history. And so the Christian conviction that God has given people freedom that makes a difference in the life and even in the salvation of the world, we can't ever completely overrule God on that one, but we can contribute or impede, actually makes history possible as a process that is open-ended and responsive to human freedom. And so just how do we talk about history and how do we think about the possibility of fate? Margaret Visser, do any of you know who Margaret Visser is? She used to be a guest on Peter Zowski's Morningside. She's a really fascinating Catholic public intellectual. She doesn't identify as Catholic on Morningside or in her...
Juanita, to the front desk, please.
Or in her... Am I still there? There we are. Or in her Massey lectures, but she has a fascinating set of Massey lectures called Beyond Fate, where she laments that the end of a Christian worldview means returning to more and more fatalistic views about history. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, check out Margaret Visser's Massey lectures. The last point I have up there, hope and human sinfulness, relates to this thing about salvation by technology too. We have Christian hope that in the end, good will triumph and evil will be wiped away. But we don't have any illusions that that's going to be some quick and easy process that can be achieved by political manipulation or technological feats, or if just people, can you just please get along, please, right? We have celebrities telling ISIS, can't you just love, man, That's not actually going to work, right? Human history is a lot messier and more complicated than that. We trust that in the end, that messiness can't finally defeat God's plan, and those of us who choose to attach ourselves to God's plan, even if we're killed in this world, will not be finally defeated, but we don't have any hope that we will save ourselves by our politics or our science or anything else, because we recognize the reality of human sinfulness. No matter how good the technology, no matter how good the political system, no matter how good anything we can construct is, we can use it for good or evil, and we always do. And so there's a certain kind of Christian realism that, on the one hand, affirms a hope for history on the grand scale, but does not have any idealistic picture of how this is going to work out. And in fact, if you read the book of Revelation, we can be led to expect that even the triumph is going to be really messy, right? It's presented, it can be read as the wrath of God, but it can also be read as the self-destruction of humanity. The fact that God is in charge does not actually stop us from blowing ourselves up. It means if we blow ourselves up, God's plan for his people is not completely undone, and his love even triumphs over blowing ourselves up, but it doesn't stop us from doing that. And so we don't have a kind of naive approach to a hope for the future that says everything will be better when we finally fix politics, science, etc. The last one I want to talk about is health. Health is a really interesting one to look at. Of course, we want to teach people healthy lifestyles, healthy attitudes, approaches to stress, ways to eat right, developing exercise regimes. That's all very good. I try to do that myself. I try to do it with my kids. Health is a great good, and we should invest a lot in good health. And that means healthcare, but that also means preventative things, and that means teaching young people good attitudes and practices towards their health. That's all very good. Health is a great good, and it's a terrible God. What do I mean by that? A God is whatever you make the highest good. It means that you will sacrifice the lower goods for that good. And you guys, some of you go to CrossFit or know people who go to CrossFit, right? Some of them wear t-shirts that say like kinda cultish. And they're self-aware that they have a kind of religious devotion to their exercise regime, right? CrossFit is great. Like, go to town, get fit, get healthy, work hard. It's great because it forms community in ways that some other gyms don't. I'm not down on CrossFit. I think it's awesome. But the problem with diet and exercise and everything else is everybody gets sick and dies. You can't beat it. And if there are people in our culture who invest more energy in their health than in any other thing, and it's a great good. You should invest a lot of energy in it, but it will let you down every time. Nobody gets out of here alive. And when our attitude towards health is such that it's such a great good, we have very little resources for dealing with life when we don't have health. And we live in a crisis as a society of what do we actually do with sick people? How do we live meaningfully if we're not healthy? My wife and I have 6 kids. People ask, is it a boy or is it a girl? And then they say, well, it doesn't matter, really if it's a boy or a girl, what matters? As long as they're healthy. Well, actually, not even that. I mean, I'll take a healthy kid over a not healthy kid if I get the choice for my kid, but even if my kid isn't well, that kid is a gift from God whose life has meaning. Now, my mom was a teacher, and many of you will have had this experience of having people with profound health challenges in your classroom. And she will tell stories about the compassion that brings out of the other students. Their suffering is not meaningless, but it contributes to the building up of our communities and our recognition of one another's humanity. And when health is this great good, what do people do when they get sick? I can't live like this. My life has no meaning. My life has no purpose. I can't live well as a sick person. We know what the answer that the culture offers us for people who are in pain, who can't live well as sick people. Better to not live at all. This is modernity's solution to a lot of suffering. Get rid of sufferers. That gets rid of suffering. what we can offer in a health class where we're teaching all the great things about diet and exercise and stress management and whatever else we're teaching is that people get sick. Sometimes people who do all the right things get sick. And their life is not meaningless because they got sick. And that we can live well when we're sick. And we can have real relationships with other people when we're sick. In fact, right to the end of it, we're all going to die. And so we should actually put some thought into how are we going to do that. Like nobody gets out of that one. If we're all going to die, then let's figure out how to die well. Lent started yesterday. One way to imagine for yourself what you're doing in Lent when you're giving up something, when you're making sacrifices, is you're practicing dying. Because death is where you're finally, in the end, whether you like it or not, forced to give up everything. And the person who dies fighting against that does not die well. But the person who gives up their spirit as a gift, who can give back everything he or she has received in this life, grace comes through that moment. And many of us have been in a room with a person who died like that. We probably have a picture of one around here somewhere. Where's the crucifix? There it is, right? That's a picture of a person who died well, turning his death into a gift. When we care for one another in those moments, remarkable human community is built. Families are healed. One of the scariest things for me about euthanasia becoming widespread in culture is that the networks of caring that we build up by looking after sick people start to disappear. And the sick people get more alone and therefore more likely to want to die, therefore more likely to be encouraged to die, therefore less likely to be visited, therefore more alone. And this is why in the Netherlands, what was initially imagined as a relatively rare way to die for people in extreme pain is becoming the normal way to die. When you get to a certain point, this is how we wrap things up, right? We're going to face sickness in our own lives, in the lives of our families. Do we have an attitude over against the culture's faith in health and beauty and youth? Do we have another faith that says that is a reasonable thing, that we can live with one another and care for each other in sickness, right? So there in every subject area, there are presuppositions and commitments that inform the way we think about and talk about subject areas. It doesn't change the answer on the physics test, but it might change the way you think about how science relates with technology or with broader society. We could have done this for a bunch of other subject areas as well. If we teach all of our subject areas in this way, it's going to be a lot harder for kids to leave our schools and say, oh, that faith thing they taught in religion class doesn't actually connect with anything. I learned science. I'm going to go be an engineer and fix things in the world, and faith doesn't really have any impact on me. The way we view the world through our lens of faith shapes the way we approach a whole host of questions, from art and beauty to sickness and dying to politics to technology. And so our job as Catholic teachers is to form ourselves in that worldview so that we can see, where does it fit in my classroom? How do I approach a question where maybe I was informed by another worldview that's rather common? Or where do I recognize it in my students or in their parents that can be challenged from a Christian point of view? This is a ton of work. I appreciate I'm giving you a huge assignment here. It's very important work, and I want to say I think you can do it. And I want to commend your administrators for inviting me to open this kind of conversation, because Catholic teachers, one of the things we do to Catholic teachers, which is not fair, I don't know so much about Manitoba. I'm in Saskatchewan with publicly funded education. They study exactly the same things in university as teachers in the public system. Then they come to a Catholic school and we say, but here it's different. And we don't always give them the tools to actually do it differently. And so as an administrative decision, to invest in our Catholic teachers to be able to make their whole curriculum and their classrooms Catholic, not just by putting up different posters or praying at certain times, but actually infusing it into our worldviews, I think is essential for the future of Catholic education. So I thank you so much for inviting me in to be part of that conversation. Almost exactly an hour. So, did anyone text any questions in? There are some. Okay, let's have a look. Yeah. So I would, skeptical, I might replace with the word critical, but I see what you mean. We're not inviting people to an uncritical appropriation of Christian faith. If we teach the faith in such a way that students get the impression that they're just being told to believe this because that's the way it is, that's a virtual guarantee that they walk out the door. That does not work. So we want to always engage with their questions. Questions are always good. Now, here's the difficulty with questions. We don't always have all the answers for them. Do your best in your area of expertise to have answers. If you don't have them, have patterns and ways of seeking them out. Get good at that. That's part of your job. But also, when a student has a question that you don't have a good answer for, you congratulate them. That is a great question. Let's work on that. You might be in a class where it's possible to create an assignment for that student around that question. You've got a great question. Let's spend some time digging into it. You can write a paper. You can do a project. Find out what the church says about this or how it's responded to these things in the past. The church is not afraid of people digging into church teaching. So really go to town. If you and also find people that you know and trust who might be people who have. We're not all going to be experts in everything, right? So find people who can answer these harder questions. But by all means, encourage a critical engagement because we're not afraid of questions. Tell them they're like Mary. They're being a good theologian. Mary said, "How can this be?" Be careful about one thing with questions. There are different ways of asking questions. And if we say in general, ask questions, because asking questions is good, some people will not distinguish between asking questions that are honest, that genuinely seek understanding, and gotcha questions. If students are doing gotcha questions, you need to step back and say the questions are welcome. The purpose of questioning is to seek understanding. Gotcha questions are not actually honest questions. And so whether they end up agreeing with the church or not, people who learn to ask honest, responsible questions instead of gotcha questions are actually better off in the world anyways, right? So questions are always good, but with the caveat, honest questions that are really seeking understanding. So I strongly encourage that. We have a tradition of reflecting on so many questions in human reality that, in my view, is unsurpassed. The Catholic Church has thought about so much that relates to the human reality and has been in so many cultural and historical contexts and faced with so many questions. There is a massive wealth of people who have reflected on really hard questions. We also live in a time where we're being faced with some newer questions that we haven't put as much time into. And that requires a little bit of patience, too. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the afternoon. But that's good for now. Let's look at another one. Yes. So they think, right? They think there's nothing nebulous in science. They presume that it's pure and objective and there's nothing, there's no fuzzy areas in it. That's not actually the case, right? actually, the more we learn about quantum physics, the weirder it gets, right? We actually have observer bias. So that, like, you can't actually do experiments that are pure and neutral because the fact that you're doing an experiment and watching it changes the result. So it's actually a false image of science that grants a kind of certainty that people want. And we want people to mature out of that. By the way, some people approach their faith the same way. Some people's attitude towards the church is, here is an anchor that is absolutely solid, that says the truth, and I will lock down here. Now, there's parts of that I actually agree with. I think the church does speak the truth, but there can be an unhealthy attitude towards the church that is naive about the way we approach human knowing, and that can often, people with a fundamentalist attitude towards the church are often people who end up misrepresenting church teaching. Happens all the time, right? So it's in that there's a temptation to fundamentalism, whether it's scientific fundamentalism or religious fundamentalism, because people don't like dealing with the fact that the world is messy. And part of like maturing is recognizing the intersubjectivity that belongs in all human knowing. And then this happens because we get proved wrong often enough, right? Sometimes you get busted so many times you start qualifying your statements a little bit, right? But we can do it not just by getting busted. We can do it by actually engaging in what does human knowing look like, and why is fundamentalism not a good way of human knowing, whether it's scientific or religious. By deciding on neutrality, does our mindset become fixed and enable us to become? Yes. But I'm not going to say deciding. I'm going to say by imagining our own neutrality, our mindset becomes fixed and we become blind to our biases. Anyone who thinks they are neutral has massive blind spots. When you get into a debate with someone, the most honest thing to do is label where you're coming from. The person who doesn't acknowledge that they're coming from a point of view will have massive blind spots, and it's very difficult to actually get anywhere in conversations with people who presume they're neutral. Now, give large groups of people who presume they're neutral political power and watch what they do to their opponents, you've got a real mess on your hands. So, false neutrality is really scary, and we need to always be on. Political ideologies always do this, but so do some other things, and religion can do it too, right? There you go. Look at that one. So, if I answer no to that question, do not hear me saying the Crusades were good, okay? Genocide is the intended extermination of a group of people based on their race or ethnicity. That was not what was going on in the Crusades. That doesn't mean the Crusades are thereby justified as a good thing. But that meant that was not the construction that was happening. Now, the Crusades are actually a very complicated phenomena. Christians did terrible things in the Crusades. By the way, some of the worst slaughter in the Crusades was Christian violence. When Western Christians arrived in Constantinople and slaughtered a bunch of Eastern Christians, that was one of the worst incidents in the Crusades. That was not genocide. It was all kinds of evil things, but it wasn't genocide. But the Crusades were actually a series of things that happened over a long time, and they weren't all the same. Some of them were successful, some of them were dismal failures, someone didn't even get where they were going. But the beginning of the Crusades was actually a call for help from Eastern Christians who had just been conquered. So we often imagine in the popular presentation that Christians sort of invaded a space that was sort of naturally and historically Islamic because they hate Muslims or something. But in fact, that was Christian territory for a long time that was conquered, and then the Christians in Constantinople asked the Pope, please send help. We've just been conquered. Can you help us throw off our conqueror, right? That's at the beginning of the Crusade. It's a whole messy, complicated thing. There's lots we could talk about with the Crusades. We don't come out smelling like roses when you do the careful investigation. but it's not the same story that the popular story is. And genocide, as generally defined, would not actually be an appropriate category because it wasn't anything aimed at extermination of a group of people based on race or ethnicity. It was an attempt to gain back land, which people have done that for a lot of wars have been fought over people trying to get land. But that was fundamentally what was at stake. Now that land was particularly important because of religious significance, but. Yes. And it's the failure to recognize how human knowing actually works. And it's a desire for certainty that's not available to us in this world. Very often it's tied up to our own insecurities, right? If I'm not... here's something I've noticed with religious fundamentalism. Young, and maybe you've seen this in your classroom, young Catholic men, interested in priesthood often, extremely rigid around liturgical things, canonical things, right? I had some friends like this who were going to seminary, and we thought, I don't think they're going to make it through seminary unless they come out of this kind of fundamentalist kind of, and sure enough, they didn't. And then I talked to a seminary professor because I started noticing a pattern among these young men. A huge number of them that I knew grew up without fathers. And so I asked a seminary professor, the really rigid guys that you end up having to ask to leave, do a lot of them not have fathers? And she said, oh my gosh, you're right. They were lacking a kind of stability in their own identity that is generally transmitted through a relationship with a father or father figure, and the church gave them something stiff and firm that stood against the world, and it was a refuge for a person who was not secure in their own identity, right? It can happen with scientific fundamentalism too, but it's a very similar human dynamic when there's this inability to live with ongoing question, inability to live with mystery, inability to live with people who I disagree with. I resort to a kind of fundamentalism. It might be religious, it might be scientific, it might be political. Lots of people have resorted to political fundamentalism in history. I mean, that might be more dangerous than these two combined, right? So, yeah. Yeah, depends what you mean by evidence-based. So, it's not the same. It's not the same as science. You can't do a measurement. These crazy things happen, right? So the Soviets sent a guy into outer space, and he looked down and he said, "I'm all the way out here, and no sign of God." Well, which Christian actually expected that the Soviet cosmonaut was going to get out in space and, there's the guy with the beard, right? So there's a certain, when the claims of faith are reduced to scientific claims, then we say, well, we can't find any evidence for them. But they were never meant to be that kind of claim in the first place. So there are certain kinds of evidence that you can't use to get to that. You need different kinds of evidence. One is the fact of existence. So philosophers have argued forever that existence does not explain itself, that everything in existence that we know might or might not have been is contingent upon a whole host of factors. And it doesn't make sense to have a whole reality made up of things that may or may not have been that are all contingent. So the fact that anything at all exists means there must be something that is non-contingent. There must be being at the root of everything that is not the same kind of being as created being. There has to be uncreated being. I find that pretty compelling evidence, but it's not scientific evidence. We can also talk about interpersonal experience, right? When the person says, God, if you're real, show me a sign, you will hear remarkable stories that happen after people do that. But can I ever prove that that was always God and never a series of coincidences from a scientific point of view? I can't. But I can look at the pattern and say, this is remarkable how often this happens. And the same thing happens in my own life. One of the things, if you have a spiritual director, you learn to watch for the pattern of God acting in your own life. And when you get good at that, it's not something you can communicate to someone in a math equation, but but you learn to recognize it in such a way that the pattern is so overwhelming. So in a way, yes, but it's different than scientific evidence. And we're convinced that there's other ways of knowing than scientific ways of knowing. Scientific ways of knowing are very valuable, but they're not the only one. And so we don't want to reduce our claims of faith to only what can be demonstrated by scientific arguments, even if there's times when they're analogous, right? One more, maybe? Or is that it? Oop. All right. The question of the sinfulness of the church. In a minute and a half. All right. Residential schools, horrific. I mean, talk to survivors, listen to some of the things that actually happened. It's as Catholics, we're all ashamed when we hear those stories, right? I wouldn't say that faith overrode reason necessarily. One of the things that happened is faith itself was overridden. One of the things that we did in the residential schools. So this was a Government of Canada project, right? The Catholic Church didn't decide we're going to set up these schools. First of all, the Government of Canada said we're going to have residential schools because we have to solve the Indian problem, right? And we have our politicians saying things like we got to take the Indian out of the child and these kinds of things. And they asked the churches, would you help us? Churches are good at education. You run schools. We have this problem. Could the churches help Canadian society? By the way, when you do this, what side of history will you be on? The right side of history when we solve the Indian problem. So will you participate with us in this project? And one of the first things we should have noticed was Catholic teaching on education has always maintained that parents are the primary educators of their children, and that if parents are not the ones educating their children, the schools are responsible first and foremost to who? Not the government, parents. That's your constituency. That's who you're cooperating with. That's who you're responsible to. Parents, according to the Catholic Church, have the God-given right and duty to be the first educators of their children. What are residential schools except the complete and intentional undermining of the role of parents in education? I mean, very explicitly, we must take them from their parents in order to strip them from their identity and culture. And Catholic teaching says you find your identity in the family, and that's where you figure out who you are. Some people may have made excuses for residential schools that it will be a way of spreading the faith, and in that sense, I can agree with the phrasing of that question. People would have justified it in the name of spreading the faith, but actually we overrode our own principles. We deliberately ignored Catholic teaching about parents' role in education and undermined it. So not only, we didn't just do something terrible in the culture, we managed to do it by undermining our own best insights and principles, which is a terrible shame and a blot. But it's not exactly that it was our own teaching that led to that. It was the ignoring deliberately of our own teaching, right? So that's an important distinction. Doesn't justify what we did at all, but it does maybe qualify the way we put the question a bit. Unless, if there's only one more, maybe we should take it, but if there's infinitely more and it's 12:01, cut it off. All right. Thank you so much. See you this afternoon.